I appreciate Senator Cornyn's questions about mental and behavioral health, something that I care a lot about. I know that you and your family have had personal experience with mental health challenges, as have I. And I agree that the mental health crisis in this country is a crisis. So let me ask you, in an interview in 2023 and again in 2024, you blamed school shootings on antidepressants. You said, and this is a quote, "There is no time in American history or human history that kids were going to shoot schools and shooting their classmates. It really started happening coterminous with the introduction of these drugs, with Prozac and with other drugs." So do you believe, as you've said, that antidepressants cause school shootings? This should be a simple question.
I don't think anybody can answer that question, and I didn't answer that question. I said it should be studied. I said it should be studied along with other potential culprits, like
so they may cause
social media. But I don't know. I would never make, because there's no science on that,
well,
Senator.
there is, Senator. I mean, excuse me, there is, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you for the promotion.
The science shows that there is no link between school shootings and antidepressants. And in fact, most school shooters were not even treated with antidepressants. And of those that were, there was no evidence of association. You know,
I don't think you can say that, Senator, because HIPAA rules, nobody knows.
Well, that is, Mr. Kennedy, do you think that people who take antidepressants are dangerous?
I think, listen, I'm not going into HHS if I'm privileged to be confirmed with any.
So you can't say that people
to impose any preconceived ideas that I may have. I just want to have good science.
So you're not saying that they aren't dangerous, which means that they could be dangerous. Let me ask you this.
That's not true.
You've described Americans who take mental health medications as addicts who need to be sent to wellness farms to recover. Is that what you believe?
No, of course I didn't say that anybody should be compelled to do anything.
No, but you said they should be sent.
I said they should be available to them. I didn't say they should be sent.
You said that folks that take antidepressants are like addicts. That I can provide that, Mr. Chair.
I think they should have the availability. Listen, I know people, including members of my family, who've had a much worse time getting off of SSRIs than people have getting off of heroin. It's the withdrawal period is, I mean, and it's written on the label.
I have some experience with this myself, Mr. Kennedy. This is personal for me. When I was a young woman and I was struggling with depression, thankfully, I had the resources to help me get through it, including a new generation of SSRI uptake inhibitors, which helped to clear my mind, get me back on track to being a mom and a wife and a productive, happy person. And I'm really grateful for that therapy. So I have some experience with this, and I think that everyone should have access to that care. And your job as secretary is to expand access to care, not to spread lies and misinformation. And you know, the things that you say, Mr. Kennedy, they live on. They have impact. Mr. Kennedy, these statements that you've made linking antidepressants to school shootings, they reinforce the stigma that people who experience mental health every day face every single day. And I'm very concerned that this is another example of your record of sharing false and misleading information that actually really hurts people.
Senator, you're mischaracterizing my statements.
I am only putting into the record what you have said, Mr. Kennedy.
You're mischaracterizing my statements, and I'm happy that you had a good experience on SSRIs. Many Americans have very good experience on it. Others have not.
That would be an issue between them and their physicians, and not for the future head of HHS to be putting out misinformation about the dangers of SSRIs and other antidepressant medication, spreading the stigma and the fear that we're actually trying to overcome.
Do you think physicians, when they make that prescription, ought to have access to good science?
Of course they do. And
that's all I believe, too. And you and I are in agreement, Senator.
And to your point that you made when you made these statements, it was not based on good science. I don't know what it was based on.
I was saying the science needed to be done. I was saying these are potential culprits were coterminous, and I named other things. I said video games. I said social media. I said SSRIs. SSRIs have a black box warning of homicidal behavior.
Mr. Chair, I will submit to the chair the information that I have about what Mr. Kennedy has said, linking antidepressants to school shootings. Thank you.
Okay, friends, I have to take his side on this. Again, with so much that I disagree with him on, in fact, most of, probably outside of this, of the health of Americans, I disagree with every political leaning of RFK Jr. So trust me, I am no fan of this man, especially not his political leanings over time. He's been very open about what his political stance is. And again, he is no conservative just because he's working for Donald Trump now. This man is a bleeding heart liberal Democrat. And I don't think he tries to say that he's not. He's not even trying to run from that. If nothing else, he's one of the most honest bleeding heart liberal Democrats that I've ever seen in my entire life. But he's 100% right, and this lady is trying to corner him. I wanted to take some excerpts from my book. Not trying to sell you my book. I'm not even going to give you the link to my book in this video because that's not what this video is about. However, I did all the research that proves this lady wrong. It's in writing. I literally have 254 footnotes in the back of the book. You know why? Because I knew people like this lady would come after me, come after my facts, come after all of this saying it's all my opinions and try to dismiss the entire book as being rhetoric and anti-pharmaceutical or whatever, right? I knew that was going to happen. So I felt it my obligation from the moment I put the first word in this book to document everything, source it all, and provide all the links and all the lines of communication going back to whether I got it from a book, a magazine article, a medical review. It didn't matter where I got it from. I put the source documentation in here. So I'm going to show you why she's wrong, the proof of how she's wrong. And as I stated in the video with the on-screen text, she's stating that that the science has said there's no direct link. You know the science she's talking about? It comes from the scientists who work for the pharmaceutical companies. Really? You know how we joke all the time about the ATF investigating themselves and the FBI investigating themselves? Okay, when the pharmaceutical companies write a report, a scientific reviewed report, peer-reviewed at that, their own peers actually applauded this. And they put this report out saying that the drug we make has no link to, quote, school shootings. Now, they're forced to put a black box warning saying that their drug can cause a side effect that is suicide and homicide. But it doesn't have any impact on school shootings. Well, maybe not directly. I'm not saying when you pop one of their pills, you immediately grab a gun and run to the nearest school. But there's a direct correlation. Now, one doesn't make anything. As I point out in the book, and I'll show you that here in a second, there are common denominators. And as these commonalities pile onto one another, certainly that danger, that threat starts to expose itself more. It's not a perfect science. It's not a perfect math to where you say, bum, 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 oh, school shooter. No, it doesn't work like that. Just like every single person who smokes their entire life doesn't suddenly come down with lung cancer. How many people do you know that got lung cancer, a 40-year-old perfectly healthy man that never smoked a cigarette in his life, and he dies of lung cancer, yet here's some 70-year-old lady in a wheelchair smoking a cigarette, and all she has is a mild cough, never any threat whatsoever of cancer. Because the body in some cases is more susceptible than other people are. Genetics, right? The gene pool and your gene pool may not make you sick, but it makes you more susceptible to some of the dangers out there. This is a perfect example of it. I'm not going to go too deep into this because it's a big, big rabbit hole, but in the book, I felt it important to explain to you why and how there became a spike in the prescribing of these medications to young people and young children. And it's in chapter 5 of my book, No Child Left Behind. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 was a bipartisan act passed by the Congress. This was basically an act that was passed in order to make these teachers, you've heard the phrases, teach to the test and not teach to learn. That's essentially when and where all of this began. Teachers and administrators were quick to identify which children were keeping the cumulative standard test scores down. In other words, they were teaching to the test. And the schools, the teachers, the school districts, they were all rewarded or penalized based on what the collective scores were of the students, right? So if you had a group of students that were bringing the collective scores down, well, they were identified pretty quick. And you notice them throughout the year, right? You were pushing towards that test at the end of the year. So you started to spot these children. I mean, how many of you were like me? I would have been one of those kids. I was well before this time of the No Child Left Behind. I would have been thrown into this category. I was the one that couldn't keep still. I was the one who read one page in a book 5 times and I didn't retain any of it. Because if I wasn't interested in the topic, I didn't retain any of it. If I was interested, one and done. Read the page, flip it, I'm good. And there were plenty of topics that I was interested in. But those that I wasn't, I couldn't learn them. I just did not retain the information. I would have been labeled as the child that brought these test scores down at that time. I write in the book, many of these children, because they are children, exhibited signs of ADHD like difficulty paying attention, fearing for their own jobs as a result of poor or potentially declining test scores. It is possible that teachers and administrators began recommending that these children receive treatment for their symptoms to settle them down and to help them focus and to score better on standardized tests. These schools could not only have grant funding and government money taken from them, but in some cases those schools could be closed down. The entire school closed down if it was a poor performing school. What happened to those that made really good test scores? They got grant money. You noticed all the nice little improvements, the new school stuff, all the cool stuff, building the new gym, all that real nice cushy stuff that happened back then. It's a result of schools that were higher performing schools with that No Child Left Behind Act in place. Now I'm getting to my point regarding the SSRIs. Another incentive for teachers and administrators to push as many children as possible into that ADHD bubble was the fact that in 1991, children diagnosed with ADHD, see, I still have it, could be included under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which allowed these children more time than their peers to take these standardized tests and allowed them to receive free tutoring, all of which would lead to a better test score. So here we go. The teachers and the administrators found a, quote, loophole that they could exploit for these poor performing children in order to get additional ways, additional help, which is fine. If the child really needed the help, good on you for getting it, right? But they classified these children because they needed as many thrown in this bucket as possible to try to get those scores up. You want to know how it all turned out? No Child Left Behind was implemented in 2002. According to the CDC, by 2011, 11% of all U.S. children ages 4 to 17 were diagnosed with ADHD, with rates up 66% from 2002 to 2012. In 10 years, the rate of ADHD rose 66%. Again, standardized testing pushed children into a box to benefit the teachers, the administrators, and the school systems. So was No Child Left Behind worth it? Nope, not even close. At best, 4th grade and 8th grade students had a slight bump in their math scores, while hardly any impact was felt on reading scores. In 2008, after 6 years of No Child Left Behind, it was reported that 40% of college freshman students still required remedial courses. We as Americans went along with the medicating of 4.4 million school-aged children, and in return we got, for the most part, a mild uptick in math skills. Now it's important that I point out that these ADHD classifications, most of those resulted in the children getting and taking SSRIs. I didn't want to bore you with all of that in the book, because all that is in the book. I go into detail in the book, those numbers, how those numbers started to skyrocket. As they started to identify these lower performing children, the teachers who are not medical professionals, in fact, there are medical professionals who are not even qualified to recommend various mood altering drugs, certainly not black box warning drugs, to these children. The teachers were recommending it on a regular basis, and as you guys know, a lot of new parents out there are young parents. They're in their 20s, and they're kind of intimidated by educational professionals, and I use that term very, very loosely. I think a lot of what we see right here is a product of why we know that the Department of Education should be done away with, because the federal government has screwed this up. Now, out of very fairness, as far as I'm concerned, This was a George W. Bush policy. This ain't a Democrat policy. W is the one who put this policy forth and got all these kids listed as ADHD, which ultimately put them on SSRIs, and we became drug addicts practically overnight. Again, you saw the number. In 10 years, that number went up 66%, which is absolutely unacceptable. Now, I'm going to cover this super briefly because I don't want to bore you on this, but I want you to understand that putting medication like this into these children's bodies and brains at such a young developmental age is very dangerous. The average baby's brain doubles in size in the first year after birth. It grows to about 80% of its adult size by age 3, and then 90% in size, nearly full grown, by age 5. The human brain pretty much completes maturing in physical size during adolescence. But critical developments within regions of the brain continue to take place well into a person's 20s. It's a well-known fact that the human brain isn't fully mature. I'm not talking about the size of it. You saw the numbers on that. I'm talking about the development of how the brain works, how it affects mood, how it affects personality, all that. It's not fully developed until 26 years old. And we're putting these chemicals, these SSRIs, we're putting these things into these children's brains when the brain is half developed on the inside, right? They're 10, 12 years old. Some children are getting SSRIs whenever they're in single digit numbers, 4, 6 years old. I've seen where 2-year-olds have gotten SSRIs in the research I've done. But most of these kids are getting it roughly around that 8, 9, 10-year-old range. Their brains, again, from a personality standpoint and a developmental standpoint, not physical, aren't even close to being fully developed. Again, we're talking about 26 years of age before they're fully developed, and we're giving this medication to them whenever they're 9. A little bit more on that. The development of the prefrontal cortex, a very significant part of the brain in terms of social interactions, is blossoming all during a young person's life. The prefrontal cortex, and this is important, affects how we regulate emotion, control impulsive behavior, assess risk, and make long-term plans. More specifically, the orbital cortex, the part of the prefrontal cortex located just above the eye sockets, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is also continuing to develop during this time. This area of the brain controls inhibition, social behavior, ethics, and morality. So think about this. We are putting poison, or if you don't want to call it poison because you think that's again, or you're taking the medication and you're against that, that's fine. Let's not call it poison. Let's say that we're putting these man-made chemicals into a child's brain that is not fully developed, and it is directly impacting the areas of the brain that control emotion, control impulsive behavior, risk, long-term plans, inhibition, social behavior, ethics, and morality. Think about all the school shooters that you know of out there, and think about, or not just school shooters, just rampage shooters in general. Think about all of them. Every single thing we just talked about right here, as far as what parts of the brain it affects, that's all the emotions that they had. The Cruzes, remember the Parkland kid, Adam Lanza, all these shooters had the exact same symptoms as far as their personality disorders. I just described every single one of them as to what gets affected by these chemicals when you put them in that brain who's developing and still forming all of these same character and personality traits. Quick point on that, based on those pieces of the brain not being fully developed, have you ever wondered why children are so impulsive and can make such bad decisions at times? It's because those parts of the brains are not fully developed yet. Want some more numbers? Over 28 million people have taken Prozac and other related antidepressant drugs such as Zoloft, Paxil, and Luvox, and most of these people experience positive results. This is my disclaimer in the book. I say this multiple times. A lot of people benefit from these drugs. But in many young people, the quote overstimulation reaction, that is a scientific term we discussed, has been linked to compulsive thoughts of suicide and violence, which shockingly occurs in an estimated 1 to 3% of patients. That is a documented number. Look at that little small 92 right there next to where it says patients, between the word patients and that. I know I'm being kind of cynical here, but I have to. That is a footnote. That is referencing one of the 254 footnotes in the back of this book that takes you directly to the publication that I got that number. That is from a scientific study. Science shows that 1% to 3% of these patients have a suicide or a violence link. You're thinking, that's not too bad. Well, if we just got through giving 28 million people all of that medication, that's 280,000 people out there that have compulsive thoughts of suicide and violence. That's a pretty big number. Now, I want to make sure you guys understand again that the brain development phase of all this is super important. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the impact of prescription drugs can be particularly disruptive and harmful to a developing child's brain and body. See, it's not just me making this up. Notice the little footnote up there again. I'm documenting all of this with, if I put anything in here as being stated as a fact, it will have a footnote next to it. Now, this is the part that really struck me as an aha moment when I was writing this book. Check this out. In almost every instance, the dosage and indication for psychotropic medications are based on extrapolated adult data. Again, it's important that you read that word adult data, which are not always appropriate for very young children. Now, this is super important. And again, it was an aha moment for me because it had never really occurred to me because I never really got into that much thought about it. They are developing, not that I think it's okay to develop this drug for little kids anyway, but they're developing dosage requirements or recommendations based on taking a fraction of what they would be giving to an adult. So either they're doing it based on just the adult dosages, in other words, using the adult dosages in some cases, or saying that, well, a child would weigh this much less than a human. You've seen that on the back of the boxes. If a child weighing this much, or they'll give an age, then give them this much medication anyway. You see it on cough syrup medications and things like that. Very important that, of course, legally you can't test this on children. In other words, you can't do case studies with drugs on children. They can't, I guess, give their permission on that, or they don't let the adults do that. So, adults are usually involved voluntarily in studies involving medications where children are not, right? So it's all a guess on what dosages we give these kids anyway. If you take a child that's a percentage of the size of an adult and you use that dosage, I guess, recommendation just based on that same percentage, it may be way too much for that child, right? And certainly if you're using the same dosage of a 30-year-old man, it's certainly not going to be applicable. Okay, so let's get into how it affects these people, right? Okay, this is getting more into how I found these commonalities. 75% of the most notorious school killers in recent history were raised in broken homes. 75% of school killers have been linked to harassment and bullying. And the last one, get this, 90% of school shootings for over a decade were linked directly to SSRI antidepressants like Prozac, Paxil, and let me turn the page here, Zoloft. And the only reason why that number is not 100% is because, kind of like what RFK said in the video that we showed, you have the HIPAA rules, right? So in some cases, HIPAA, in a lot of cases when you subpoena these records for some kind of a court proceeding regarding one of these school shootings or mass shootings or rampage shootings, you can get this documentation, right? I mean, in some cases, both sides want it. One side's wanting to use it against the killer, and one side's wanting to use it to protect against the killer and say, oh, this is why. In some cases, they may. I've read where black box warnings were used in the defendant's case to say that the medication is what made them do this, not the actual person. Again, sidestepping any kind of real responsibility right there, although I think it was a contributing factor. So it's important that we understand in cases like this that you do have the likelihood that every single rampage killer or shooter in history has been on some form of a mood-altering drug. But some of this stuff gets suppressed in the court cases. When this lady says that there's no proof that they were used, in some cases they are cherry-picking the cases where the court system tried to block, using the HIPAA rule, tried to block access to the medical records. In fact, the pharmaceutical industries, and it's in my book, I have proof of this, pharmaceutical industries have paid a lot of money to try to keep court documents sealed. In other words, some of this information did in fact come out in these court proceedings, but the pharmaceutical industries paid to have these court documents sealed so that you and I could not see them. Why? Why would the pharmaceutical industry do that? Because the drugs that they were giving to these children had a very probably direct effect in many cases to what actually happened. And the only person that would benefit from sealing these documents were the ones writing the checks to seal them, pharmaceutical industry. So I'm going to give you the first few school shooters that I have that I document in this book. And I go through here and I show each one that is documented to have been either bullied from a broken home or over-medicated. This is one right here that was kind of interesting to me. The Virginia Tech shooter. Yes, I'm going to call that a school shooter, even though it was a college. Technically, it is a school, and everybody else calls it a school shooter, so I included it. I wrote, it still amazes me how many, quote, experts either ignore facts in their respective fields or are purposely deceptive. It's important that you hear this because this shows you the cover-up and how pharmaceutical funding controls facts and real data in this country. When medical records were finally released for Doug Rollins, excuse me, remember, was the shooter. Doug Rollins, a toxicologist at the Center for Human Toxicology at the University of Utah, stated, quote, I would say that drugs probably did not play a role in his actions on that particular day. Most of those drugs, once they're in the bloodstream, they're not having a pharmacological effect. Mr. Rollins made sure to say probably and most, because he clearly wasn't certain if drugs played a role in Cho's actions, and he surely knew that many drugs do not need to be in the bloodstream in order to affect the patient. Again, referencing back to what RFK said in this very hearing. He says that remember, she tried to tie him saying that he was calling people who take these drugs drug addicts. No, he was pointing out that they're more addictive in most cases than street drugs because you can't get off of them. You can't get off of them cold turkey in most cases. In a lot of cases, they have to wean you off the drugs, just like heroin or something else. Some of these drugs, you start taking a little less, because if you get off of them cold turkey, it causes all kinds of problems. These drugs can stay in your system for as long as 6 months for you to rehabilitate off of them. You cannot just get off of these drugs. So by him saying that the drug wasn't in his bloodstream, it does not mean that the drug was not still affecting him mentally. In fact, the side effect of quitting these drugs, because that's what Cho did, Cho quit taking his drugs cold turkey. Just stopped. He was not weaned off of them. That's the Virginia Tech shooter. When he stopped taking them, it was shortly thereafter when the shooting took place. One of the biggest side effects of quitting them cold turkey is it exacerbates those symptoms. It makes him worse. So if he had suicidal or homicidal thoughts before, it made them way worse. It amplified them. So this doctor is a paid shill when it comes to pharmaceuticals because clearly he was being paid to say that. And I guarantee you, if you looked at his financial information, he got a little something later on for Christmas time. Along that same lines, I wanted to point out in 2003, British officials warned doctors, get this, warned doctors against prescribing Paxil, the antidepressant that Cho had been taking for depression in children and teens. The statement from the UK's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency stated, quote, it has become clear that the benefits of Paxil in children for the treatment of depressive illness do not outweigh these risks. So the good doctor that was making his statement in the courts was lying. He was basically being the, quote, expert on the stand and lying where he just assumed people would never find out that he was lying. And I'm telling you, he was lying. On to the next one. Eric Harris. Oh, you remember this? Columbine. Yeah, people wanted to blow that away also. A great deal of effort has gone into attempting to build the narrative that the Luvox, which is fluoxamine, found in Eric Harris' bloodstream during his autopsy had no effect whatsoever on his actions and that SSRIs are completely harmless. Quote, Jefferson County authorities confirmed Monday that Eric Harris had a psychotropic drug called Luvox in his bloodstream, but an expert said there is no scientific evidence connecting medication to behavior changes that involve hostile outbursts. Despite a cascade of research, there is little valid evidence to prove a causal relationship between the use of antidepressant medications and destructive behavior. On the other hand, there is ample evidence that undiagnosed and untreated mental illness exacts a heavy toll on those who suffer from these disorders, as well as those around them. That's from CNN.com. But according to the manufacturer of this drug, this is not true. 4% of young people taking Luvox had developed mania during short-term controlled clinical trials. Mania is a psychosis which can produce bizarre, grandiose, highly elaborated destructive plans, including mass murder. Notice the 128 next to that. That means these are not my words. That means that I took these from a scientific publication who included mass murder as a side effect of the drug that one of the most notorious school shooters in history, Eric Harris, was taking. And finally, you guys remember Adam Lanza from Newtown reports that Lanza's psychiatric issues were, quote, completely untreated in the years before the shooting, unquote, are false. Again, notice the 139. That is again a footnote. Lanza had not only received therapeutic treatment for communication and sensory issues as early as 3 years old, but when he was 14 had been prescribed and took antidepressant Celexa or Lexapro. Both of these antidepressants are part of the SSR family and are prescribed for symptoms of major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. Reports vary as to how Lanza took the prescribed medication because, due to sealed records and other obstacles, I was not able to confirm the length of time with any certainty. So covered up. Somebody paid to have the record sealed. The last one, Parkland. Remember Nicholas Cruz, who shot and killed 17 youngsters in Florida during, I think it was 2017, February 14th of 2017? Nicholas Cruz was no stranger to mood-altering drugs. It's reported that doctors at Henderson Behavioral Health had prescribed him Focalin, Clonidine, and Risperidone. And during Cruz's confession, he admitted to taking lots of drugs, quote-unquote, including Xanax and marijuana. The side effects he could expect to experience from the 4 prescription drugs alone, not including the marijuana, include hallucinations, behavior problems, aggression, hostility, paranoia, anxiety, depression, agitation, confusion, trouble thinking, impaired judgment, suicide, mania, feeling on edge, irritability, insomnia, nervousness, restlessness, abnormal dreams, fear, thoughts, hurting oneself, unusual risk-taking, and no fear of danger. This came from the manufacturer's own paperwork. This is available to anybody who wants to know that it's out there. If you are prescribing these drugs for your children, you should be reading what these side effects are. I apologize for taking you guys down that deep dive, but it's important. I say this all the time. It's important that I call the lies out of the media and these frickin' politicians. It drives me nuts that they can sit here in some cases, in many cases, under oath and lie like that. But they lie because their little interns give them the information so they can claim plausible deniability and say, oh, well, my intern got that, so they're the ones who believed it. They just gave it to me. Had I done my own research, I might have come to a different conclusion and come across the actual facts that show that what I'm saying is wrong. This lady was lying to the American people's face. This lady was trying to drag RFK based on lies. Everything he said was right and accurate. One more time before I leave, I want to point this out again. This is in my book multiple times. Clearly, SSRIs and other mood-altering drugs can serve a significant purpose in helping many people cope with psychological challenges they face. These drugs have proven effective in providing many people the tools necessary to face otherwise daunting challenges and obstacles in their lives. But it would be willfully ignorant of us as a society to ignore the potential negative effects these medications have on some individuals. We are doing a disservice to the American people and certainly to our children whenever we don't do our own due diligence and we just openly and blindly give these children these drugs. Let me say this in closing. There is a direct recorded link. You can find it here. Pharmaceuticals ain't going to tell you about that link. They're going to tell you because the FBI told you that they have to put a black box warning on there, but they're going to tell you that it may make a killer. Oh, but that killer's not going to go to a school. This lady was lying. I can tell you that there's a direct link between SSRI, psychotropic drugs, whatever you want to call them, mood-altering drugs. There's a direct link to contributing to. It doesn't make a rampage killer, but there's a direct link to the ones that have been, just like some of the things that you hear out there. Not every person who takes an SSRI is a rampage killer, but every rampage killer has taken an SSRI.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America. He's so horrible.